Well, just to start out, we're going to be talking about all these different levels during the course of the semester. We're going to be talking about chemical levels, we're going to be talking about cellular levels, tissue levels, organ levels, system levels, and the whole body as a whole level, because you can't just look at one without the other. So we're going to be talking about each of these different sections. So let's first talk a little bit about what's the chemical level. Well, basically, if you look around at your neighbors and your friends and people within your house over the past month or whatever the case may be, just look around and they all look different. But you know what? On the deepest fundamental level, basically they're all the same. They're all made up of atoms. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, sulfur, sodium, potassium, magnesium, down the road. We're all basically a hodgepodge of all these atoms that are in our body that work in certain ways. And we're going to be talking about a lot of these. We're going to talk a lot about oxygen. We're going to be talking a lot about hydrogen. We'll be talking a lot about sodium. Sodium is going to drive you nuts. Potassium is going to also drive you nuts. Also things like calcium. Calcium is really important, and people have a lot of misconceptions about calcium. Okay, we'll talk about that when we get to the osseous section. Okay, but what happens is the atoms are the smallest unit of matter. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about those in just a second, and how X-ray involves atoms. It does. We also have molecules. Molecules are basically, by definition, a combination of atoms. We take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, put it together, and we have a molecule. We have really simple molecules like water, H2O, 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. Or we have carbon dioxide, CO2, 1 part carbon, 2 parts oxygen. And they mix and mingle, and they create this structure that has a purpose. And we'll talk a lot about water, we'll talk a lot about carbon dioxide, we'll talk a lot about oxygen. Oxygen actually occurs more naturally as a paired O2 as compared to just oxygen. Okay, we have a little bit more complex molecules such as glucose, C6H12O6, which is interesting because what happens is when the body uses C6H12O6, 6 parts of carbon, 12 parts of hydrogen, and 6 parts of oxygen, when it's done with it, you know what we have? Carbon dioxide and water. We have CO2 and H2O. It gets boiled down to some simpler molecules, carbon dioxide and water. Okay. Then we have, other molecules, proteins. Our body is full of proteins. Proteins are quite complex molecules. There are all kinds of molecules that are folded and on top of each other and bound together and wrapped all up in with high energy bond strings that will keep things together. And then we have the mother of all mothers, DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, which is the genetic material or the structure of life. It's a very complex, but in some ways, a very beautiful structure. Well, what really is DNA? Everybody says, well, it's my eye color or my hair color or whatever the case may be. And yeah, I suppose in a little way it is, okay? But our DNA has a lot more than that. It has what's called our genetic code, okay? And what happens is with binding of these bases, it actually has a code for, and get this, ready for this, now clear your mind, think about this. It has the code for how to make protein. And there are different types of proteins. So every code, it's the cookbook, the Betty Crocker cookbook of how to make all the proteins that my body needs. Okay, so it has all these proteins that are stored in memory in this DNA by the way these base pairs line up on these double strands of sugar. Okay, and that's what it is. What happens is I get these very long strands of DNA. Okay, and and then they wind them up like they look like ramen. They wind them up, and they actually wind up into like an X. The center is called a centromere, and part of it comes one way and part of it comes the other way. So I'll have one leg. I'll have one leg of the. Let me just draw it this way. I have one leg coming this. Well, this is not a good picture. It's a good color. I have one leg coming like this, okay, and then I'll have another leg coming like this, and they join together in the middle right here at what's called a centromere. Okay, and basically that's what we have, and these things are called chromosomes. I have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Okay, and these 23 pairs of chromosomes are in one place in our cell. They're in our nucleus of our cell. Each cell has a nucleus, with the exception of maybe red blood cells and a couple other odd exceptions. Cells have a nucleus, Inside that nucleus of every cell in our body, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And those chromosomes have a code that says, this is me. Okay? It's unique for every individual, unless, of course, you have an identical twin. If you have an identical twin, guess what? They have your chromosomes too. Okay? But what happens is, along these chromosomes, okay, at little parts, all the way along the chromosomes, little spots all over the chromosomes, are little special areas. And these little special areas are called genes. Now, the gene could be only a couple segments long, or it could be really long, depends upon what it's coding for. And these genes are the specific areas on the chromosomes that have that cookbook genetic information as to how to make all these proteins in my body. Okay? And that's what those genes are. It's interesting. A number of years ago, they did what was called the Genome Project. And the Genome Project actually was trying to take and make a map of all the chromosomes, of all the 23 pairs of chromosomes. And what happens, they're trying to make a map. And what they're doing is they're trying to identify where each gene is on each chromosome, which worked out pretty well, okay? What they found was, and this was the interesting thing about chromosomes, they found out that the majority of the material in my DNA, you know what it meant? Nothing. It was zero. It had no significant code. There was nothing that it coded for, okay? So they just said, oh, geez, what's going on? And some people actually think it might have been old viruses that incorporate. This is getting off the track, but now, especially with all this COVID stuff, what is a virus? A virus is a piece of DNA or RNA. And what the piece of DNA RNA is enclosed in a capsule, and the body takes it in one way or the other, whether it's by inhalation, injection, whatever the case may be. This piece of DNA or RNA that's in a capsule gets in the body. Once it gets in the body, that capsule releases the piece of DNA, and the DNA migrates and gets in the area of my nucleus of the cells and incorporates itself somewhere in my chromosomes. And when it incorporates it somewhere in my chromosomes, it has the code for making the protein from more DNA and RNA. And therefore it replicates itself. That's why we can't kill it. It gets incorporated in all our cells, and it was never alive to start out with, so we can't kill something that was never alive. Okay? But that's just a little bit of byproduct of what we're talking about. But what happens is these areas along the chromosomes that have this genetic information, by the way that these base pairs are lined up, are called genes. Okay, and we have tons and tons of genes. And in fact, what we find is a lot of the diseases that we have, when they look at that, they realize that a lot of these diseases have a relationship to an abnormal protein, muscular dystrophy. In muscular dystrophy, there's a certain protein that should be made in one of the chromosomes on the Y chromosome, the 23rd pair of chromosomes on the Y chromosome, because it only occurs in males. Okay, there's a certain type Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and what they find out is that the code was somehow altered in that DNA sequence, in that sequence of nucleotides, the nucleic bases, the nitrogenous bases. They find out that that code was somehow altered. Therefore, because it was altered, it makes the wrong protein. It makes a protein that's like it, but it's not the right protein. It doesn't work. As a result, that frequently results in what we call disease. Okay, and that's where we're at with that. So that's DNA. Now, so then we've talked. So now we've talked about the atomic level. Okay. One level up from that, we have the cellular level. And what is a cell? A cell is the basic structural and functional unit of the body. It's alive, with the exception of a couple types of cells, okay, that really don't have a whole lot to say, okay? But cells are basically the basic structural and functional unit of the body. We'll be talking, after we get through this first section, we'll be talking a lot about cells and cell structure. They're the smallest natural living units in the body. They are alive. They actually are their own ecosystem, all in one, okay? And what we find out is when we look at the body, and you're going to see this in labs and stuff like that, that there are a number of variations. Smooth muscle cells, nerve cells, epithelial cells, cardiac muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells, all kinds of different types of cells that all have different purposes, okay? This right here would be actually looking at a bunch of cells. All those little darker purple things are basically the nuclei of cells that are lined up. So those are all similar cells. They're all lined up, and basically, that could be, whatever tissue that might be. What happens is we go up one level from that, and we go up one level, and we're at the tissue level. Now, a tissue is basically a group of cells all working and performing together for a particular function. We have a bunch of different types of tissue, epithelial tissues. Epithelial means, epi means upon. Epithelial tissues are cells that are tissues that are coverings or linings. So the skin is an epithelial tissue because it's covering my body. All the inside of my mouth, down my esophagus, down through the intestines, those are all epithelial tissues because they line the inside of a structure. On the outside, if I opened up my belly and looked at the outside of all my intestines and everything, there's also a membrane on the outside, which is also epithelial tissue. Connective tissue is, guess what connective tissue does? It connects. Okay, bones are connective tissue, ligaments are connective tissue, fat's a connective tissue, tendons are connective tissue, fibrous tissue is connective tissue. Actually, blood is also considered a connective tissue as well. So I have connective tissue. We have muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is basically made so that what happens is the muscle can contract, can get shorter, and by doing that, it makes motion. So that's a different type of tissue. Nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is built to be able to conduct an impulse. Okay, some of the nerves that we have that go from our brain to wherever my big toe might be multiple feet long. I mean, they're microscopic in width, but they could be multiple feet long. So nervous tissue. So these are different types of tissues, and you see, like different type. These where you see these little circular things or ovoid things, those are all columnar cells and creating a tissue, which is a lining. That's an epithelial tissue. Next, we get to organs. Okay, now organ is where I have a bunch of different tissues that are put together. Okay, in other words, if I look at an organ, there'll be multiple different tissues that are all working together for some common purpose. Okay, most of these organs have some type of a reproducible shape. If you looked up at the thing right up at the top, you'd say, oh, even if it didn't say stomach there, you'd know that was a stomach because that's what the stomach would look like. Heart. Everybody says, if I was to draw a picture of a heart, I would think everybody draw a picture of a heart. A brain. Everybody draws a picture of a brain. So I have a reproducible shape. There are some variations and stuff like that, but what happens is in each of those tissues, I have each of those organs, I have a bunch of different types of tissues that are put together for a common function or common purpose. Okay, so the stomach has an outer epithelial tissue. So if I looked at the outside of the stomach, there'd be epithelial on the outside as well as on the inside, and then we have connective tissue that holds the layers together. Plus, I have bands, at least 4 different bands or 4 different layers of muscle in the middle. So basically, I have multiple different tissues that are all working together for a purpose. Okay, so if I looked at here, this is actually a stomach that's been removed. This is fatty tissue on the outside, but here's the stomach. If I was to draw a picture of where the stomach is this area right in here, and basically we'd look at and this whole area is the stomach in here, and that would be incorporating a number of different types of tissues. Finally, we get to the system. System means I have a bunch of organs that work together as a common function, such as the GI system. GI system involves the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, as well as things like the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, and even a little bit with the spleen. Okay, so they all work together for a common purpose. Okay, and what we find is some organs in one system may also contribute to another system. If I look at the kidneys. The kidneys are involved with relieving the body of extra waste, which is basically by the urination, but also is involved in things such as red blood cell production and blood pressure control. So it affects the cardiovascular system and affects the hematological system. So some organs may be involved in multiple different systems. But when we look at a system is basically a group of organs that have a common purpose. Okay, and there are a number of different systems. We'll be talking about most of these systems as the course goes on. Okay, this is just looking inside the abdomen, a cadaver abdomen. So we see the liver. This would be the liver up here. Here's the gallbladder sitting right here. Here's the stomach you see right there. This area right here coming around this way, it comes down this way and up this way and down like that. That'd be the large intestine, and this is all the small intestine in here. So you see all that stuff in there. So that's basically part of the gastrointestinal system. And finally, I take this all together, everything we've talked about thus far, and put it all together, and I have a living organism. We have a living individual, which is a sum of all parts. And if I take that individual, I could break it down to systems, but I could go further down into organs, and I go further down into tissues, and I could go further down into cells. If I took cells from this kid and put it in that body, what happens? The cells would look the same. They would look very similar to being the same. You couldn't tell one person from the other. Why? Because the cells are the same. And many of the organs will look the same. The tissues would look the same. The only thing that looks different on the outside. So basically what happens is the body is this combination of multiple different hierarchies of structure. Atoms, or the chemical portion, to cells, to tissues, to organs, to systems, to result in an individual. Chemical, cellular, tissue, organ, system, and how it affects the whole body, because the body likes to be the same. The body, even though we look different, the body likes to be the same, and that's what we call homeostasis, which hopefully what you've realized now is that we're a lot more than we look like from the outside. We're a lot the same inside. Chemically, we're the same. If I was to go around, and you were in class, okay, and if I was to go around and take blood from everybody and looked at the blood findings from everybody, guess what? Your blood findings would be really, really close to everybody. Why? Because everybody's about the same chemically. There's not that much different. If I was to take tissue out of everybody, or look at someone's individual cells and look at tissues, they would look the same. If I was to take somebody's stomach and say, okay, for extra credit, bring me in your stomach and pop it on. Don't do that, please. What happens is then what happened, look, a bunch of stomachs, they look the same. But the thing about it is when I put this all together, I have an organism, and even though we look different on the outside, we're very much the same. Deep down inside, we all run the same way. We're all on the same clock. We're all on the same mechanisms. We all work very similar to what the person next to you does. The person across the table of you from you at dinner. The guy that's parking the car out in the parking lot. They're all the same, basically on all these levels. What happens in you, I could understand physiologically and anatomically what happens in you, all the way down the road.